At 5:15 p.m. on June 28, 1980, a 38-year-old man named Robert Davidson drove his motorcycle down Interstate 74 in Acton, Indiana, which is a small community just outside of Indianapolis. On the back of the motorcycle, with her arms wrapped around his waist, was Robert's wife. Her name was Wanda. The couple was on their way to visit family, and they were hoping to get there as soon as possible, not because they wanted to visit, but because there was a big storm rolling in, and they were hoping to beat the rain. In fact, right now, right above them, the sky was turning a dark gray and looked very ominous. But as Robert nudged his engine to go a little bit faster, these big raindrops began pelting his arms, and he knew the skies were opening up and he would have to pull over so he and his wife could put on rain jackets. And so Robert pulled over to the side of the road, and as soon as he was stopped, Wanda climbed off, and Robert was about to climb off as well and open up the little trunk in the back of the motorcycle to get the rain jackets. But before he did that, there was this sudden flash of light, and then Robert felt pain all throughout his body. His muscles went totally rigid, and then he crumpled off his bike onto the ground, and everything went black. Less than 5 minutes later, an ambulance arrived on the scene, and several first responders jumped out, including a woman named Kimberly Cobb. Now, Kimberly had been briefed up on this situation. A man and his wife had pulled over on the side of Interstate 74, and the man had been struck by lightning. And so as she ran up to the couple, she could see Robert was on the ground. He was not moving. His skin was waxy and gray, and his wife was sort of in shock, and she was standing next to him, just kind of sobbing uncontrollably. And Kimberly, she jumped into action. She jumped down next to Robert, and she felt for a pulse, but he didn't have one. At this point, Kimberly knew she maybe had a couple of minutes here to basically revive Robert, or he was doomed. And so Kimberly, she worked immediately on stabilizing Robert's spine while one of her team members, one of the other first responders, jumped in and began doing CPR. And then a third first responder hopped on the ambulance radio and called in an emergency medical helicopter to get here and fly Robert to a hospital as soon as possible. They quickly got a response from the helicopter crew saying they were en route. But before the crew or any of the first responders could communicate any further over the radio, suddenly, out of nowhere, their ambulance just completely shut down, like completely shut off. The lights, the sirens, the engine, everything went completely silent. And this was a huge problem because some of the medical equipment that they needed to keep Robert alive until the helicopter got here required the ambulance to be on to use it. And so with the ambulance off, it was useless. But in addition to just what a problem this was, this also was like really confusing to Kimberly and the other first responders. Because when ambulances are built, they are built with the idea that there can never be a situation where the ambulance just totally turns off. Because again, it's like a worst case scenario. And so they give each ambulance 2 batteries, a primary and a backup, so that if for some reason the primary dies, you always have that backup and can always use the life-saving equipment. So the idea that both of these batteries failed simultaneously was like, how? How could that possibly happen? But before Kimberly or the other first responders could even begin to understand how that happened, something else began happening. They turned and saw there was this woman dressed in this old, long black dress running up the road, this desolate highway. This woman is charging up the road, screaming at them, and above her head, she's waving a Bible, and she's yelling at them to, hey, let me touch him. Let me touch him. I can save him. And the first responders are looking at each other like, what is going on here? Now, none of the first responders, nor Wanda, had any idea who this woman was as she continued running up the road, waving her Bible and yelling at them. But again, you need to picture this scene. The ambulance is off. They can't do anything to help Robert. They're basically waiting for the helicopter to show up, which they hope is on the way, but they can't communicate with the helicopter. And Robert basically is clinically dead at this point. He doesn't have a pulse. He's been struck by lightning. Like there's nothing anybody can do except wait around and hope the helicopter shows up. And so when this woman came running up to the scene saying she could touch Robert and save him, none of the first responders were like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Let's bring her in. She can save the day. But they were sort of like, well, no one else is doing anything. And they looked over at Wanda, and she was just as shocked as they were at this woman's arrival and what she was saying. And so the first responders and Wanda just kind of stood there and allowed this woman in her black dress with her Bible to just wander up and crouch down next to Robert and begin this totally bizarre ritual. At first, the woman just began praying over Robert, and she's holding her Bible, and she's very focused and she's calm. And again, Kimberly, the first responders, and Wanda, they're all just standing there looking at each other and looking at this woman being like, what is going on here? But then eventually this woman in black, she begins getting really animated and begins slamming her Bible on the ground over and over again and begins screaming up at the heavens, demanding they save this man's life. Now, Kimberly and the others and Wanda, they're all watching this in total shock and just kind of let it keep on happening. Because again, it was sort of like, at this point, we're already committed, and what harm can this woman do? I mean, Robert's clinically dead. And so Kimberly and the others just stood there silently watching as this woman in black continued to slam her Bible and demand that this man be saved. And then it was like something came over this woman. It was like she was completely possessed, and she grabbed her Bible and she lifted it over her head. She's kneeling right beside Robert. And when she opened her mouth and looked up at the sky, it wasn't her voice that came out. It was like another voice, and she began speaking in tongues, things that didn't make any sense. She's saying all these crazy gibberish things to the sky. And as Kimberly and the others are getting frightened by what they're seeing and are about to step in, it was like the woman just stopped. And she stood up slowly, turned, and walked down the road back the direction she came. And within seconds of this woman beginning to walk off, the ambulance turned back on, lights, sirens, the engine all came back on, nothing wrong with it, and Robert began to breathe. Kimberly and the other first responders and Wanda just stared at Robert in total shock. He had not had a heartbeat for several minutes, like he was dead. How he's alive when there was no medical intervention, really, because the ambulance was off. The only intervention was this woman and whatever she was doing. Like, nobody could comprehend that. But before anybody could make sense of that, the medical helicopter arrived, and seconds later it was chaos getting Robert onto the helicopter. And then before long, Robert, Wanda, and the helicopter took off, and then before long, Kimberly and the other first responders were just left there in the first moment of silence they had for several minutes, just standing on the side of Interstate 74 thinking, what just happened? Now, none of the first responders wanted to admit to this, but they were all thinking the same thing. That woman in black had to have done something that, brought Robert back to life. I mean, there really was no other explanation. However, when the first responders just all kind of looked in the direction where this woman had turned and walked off just a couple of minutes earlier, she was gone. Now keep in mind where she had come from, where she had, run up the road from. It was just one big open road with really no obstructions, and then off to the side of the road was this huge open field. Basically, if someone had been walking for only a couple of minutes in that direction, from their vantage point, they would have seen them. There's nowhere to hide, there's nowhere to go. But she was gone. However, Kimberly and the other first responders would quickly learn that this particular stretch of highway, in fact, more specifically, the field off the side of this highway, had great significance to this whole story. That big field that lined Interstate 74, where effectively the woman in black had disappeared to, used to be the home of a place called the Acton Campground, which was a Methodist community in the 1800s. The members of this community were known for their really loud prayer style and also for speaking in tongues. Now, unfortunately, this community actually burned to the ground in 1864. Afterwards, they rebuilt, but then in 1905, disaster struck again and it burned to the ground again. And this time they did not rebuild. Instead, the community was leveled to the ground, was sold off, and then eventually was just abandoned and became a big empty field. After the story of Robert's miraculous recovery began to spread, some people began to think that the woman in black might have been a ghost of one of these Acton residents from the 1800s who basically was drawn out to save Robert's life. Also, her intense prayers and speaking in tongues, along with the woman disappearing back into the field where the Acton campground had been, certainly seemed to cement the idea that this theory could actually be true. However, since that day in 1980, no one has seen the woman in black again. One evening in February of 2011, a man in his 30s named Yang was eating dinner inside of his home in a rural village in China. Around him at the table were his 5 elderly aunts, who he lived with and took care of. Now, nobody spoke over dinner. It was totally silent. But this was common, and it was not awkward at all, because Yang actually preferred silence. He had been born with a disability that made it nearly impossible for him to speak. It also had left him blind in one eye, and over the course of Yang's life, he had been sort of bullied for his disability. And as a result, he really didn't like being around other people, and he certainly didn't like trying to talk to other people. I mean, that was really, again, something he had a really hard time doing. But in his life, the few people that totally accepted him and loved him were his family, in particular his 5 aunts. They didn't care at all that basically he never spoke. And so, for example, at this dinner table, there was no expectation that anybody would speak. And Yang loved it. But more than just feeling happy that he could be himself around his aunts, Yang also took a lot of pride in looking after his aunts. You know, he wanted to make sure they were comfortable and well looked after in their old age. So after this silent dinner, Yang stood up and he cleaned the table off, and then he helped one of his aunts go up to her bedroom. And after getting her tucked in, and as Yang was about to go down and help the next aunt go to her bedroom, he heard sirens outside. Now, Yang lives in this very remote rural village in China that's actually so remote they didn't have their own police force. But even more specifically, Yang literally in his whole life had never even heard a siren or seen a police car. And so this is like really unique. And so instead of going and helping his next aunt, Yang went outside to see what was going on. And as soon as he got out there, he looked down the hill. He was up on top of this hill. That's where his house was. He saw at the base of the hill, about 600 feet away, were 2 police cars with their lights flashing. I mean, clearly something major was happening in his town. And so again, feeling very curious because he's never seen anything like this, Yang decides to continue to investigate. And so he leaves his home and begins walking down the road towards the cars. But he stops at a safe distance away because 1, he doesn't want to interfere, and 2, he really doesn't want to talk to the police because he can't really talk. And he's actually worried that he's going to get bullied if he talks to the police. And so from a safe distance, he just stood there and watched whatever was going on. And what was going on is the 2 police officers who had responded and shown up in Yang's village were standing there at the foot of this hill trying to make sense of this insane story a local farmer had just told them. The man was sitting there, his face was in his hands, he was crying hysterically, and he was trying to give them more information, but it was like he was too upset. And finally, one of the officers tells the guy, like, hey, stop what you're doing, start all over again, calm down, and just tell us the story from the beginning. And at this, the farmer did calm down, and after taking a deep breath, he told the officer the story. He said about a week earlier, he had this horrible nightmare. He said he dreamed of his mother and she was shrouded in darkness and she was terrified and she was screaming for his help. And the farmer said, in the dream, he ran to his mother to try to save her. But as soon as he would get close to her, it was like this shadow went over his mother and then she disappeared. And then the farmer would wake up and he'd be so terrified and so upset. Now, at first, the farmer told the officer that, he didn't think much of this nightmare. He was not a superstitious person. He just thought, it's a nightmare. But over the next several days, he kept having the same nightmare about his mother that, she was scared and then she would disappear as soon as he went to help her. And so after a week of these horrible dreams, the farmer said he finally decided, I'm just gonna go check on my mother in person and make sure she's okay. But when he went to his mother's place, his mother was missing and he couldn't find her anywhere. And he had this horrible thought that she'd been abducted. And so he had called the police. Now, the police did understand that it was totally bizarre that they were here ultimately because of some guy's nightmare. But when they went to his mother's place, she really was missing. And so they ultimately told the farmer to just go home and that they would put together a search party and they would look for his mother. And so after the farmer said okay and then headed back towards his place, the 2 officers got back in their cruisers and they drove out of the village past Yang, who was still standing there watching everything happening, back to the police station. And there, the officers immediately coordinated 2 investigative teams that would go out and look for the farmer's mother. Now, one of these teams was sent to a local city to basically canvass the area to see if she was there. But that search proved to be fruitless. And then the other investigative team, they were sent back to the village. And when they were there, they went door to door asking all the residents if they had any idea what happened to this farmer's mother. And it was during this search in the village that they got a tip. And that tip would lead them to a very specific location, Yang's home. And when police went to Yang's home, they found the front door was wide open. But when they walked right up and yelled inside of the home, calling out for Yang, nobody yelled back. In fact, the home was totally dark and silent. And so after a few more minutes of police calling out for anyone inside the home to come out and talk to them and not getting an answer, the police decided to walk inside. And so into this dark, cramped home they went. And as they walked, they noticed there were all these dirty towels and dirty dishes and sort of trash everywhere. I mean, the place was kind of a pigsty. And again, it's eerily silent. Every step they took, they were walking on these boards that creaked with every step. And as they're moving, they're calling out, Yang, if you're in here, come out. But again, it's totally silent. And they eventually make their way to the very back of the home. Now, the police really did not know what to expect when they showed up at Yang's place, but they did hope that by going there, they would somehow, some way find a reasonable explanation for all of this. The dream that kicked off this investigation and this totally bizarre tip they got. I mean, they really just wanted to put this thing to bed, and they were hoping that by going to Yang's place, they would get that. However, when the police walked into the very last room they had not searched yet, the very back of his home, they knew there was no reasonable explanation here. That back room is where Yang's aunts all slept. And when the police walked into that room, sure enough, the aunts were in their beds where Yang had left them. However, the police realized, wait a minute, we have been yelling and screaming and trying to get people to come out of the home, yet all these women are still asleep. How could they possibly sleep through all that commotion? But as the police walked up to each of these 5 women, they realized the outlandish tip that had sent them here in the first place had to be correct. It would turn out Yang did not harm that farmer's mother. In fact, he did the opposite. She was one of his 5 elderly aunts, and he went to great lengths to care for each of these women. I mean, he basically would have done anything for them. However, there was a problem. His 5 aunts were dead, and had been for a long time. While Yang considered these women to be his family, literally, I mean, he called them his aunts, in reality, he was not related to them at all. Instead, these were just women from the local village where he lived who had been nice to him. They had all died of natural causes. But Yang didn't understand it when they passed away. Instead, all Yang knew is that he was sort of an outcast and that nobody respected him and he was treated really badly by most people except for these women. They'd been the only people that really cared about him. And so after they died, he felt really sad and lonely. And so, one by one, he dug these women up and brought them home with him and began caring for them as if they were still alive. When that farmer had gone to go check on his mother after having the recurring nightmare about, her going missing, he had gone to her gravesite and found her coffin was literally empty, hence believing somebody had abducted her body. And then the strange tip police got that led them literally to Yang's house was a local had seen Yang carrying a body up the hill to his home. And his home actually was not a typical home. Instead, Yang's home was actually just a cave that he had outfitted with some boards on the ground for a floor and a couple of makeshift beds. Yang was arrested for what he did, but ultimately he was sent to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. All of the bodies that Yang stole were reburied, and the farmer's recurring nightmares about his mother stopped as soon as her body was returned to her grave. On the morning of Friday, May 21st, 2010, 68-year-old Dennis Kola sat down for breakfast with his wife Myrna inside of their kitchen in their spacious 4-bedroom house in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Dennis picked up the newspaper and, like always, began reading the front page out loud to Myrna. This was an activity the couple enjoyed doing together every morning. According to the story on the front page, the stock market was struggling and unemployment was on the rise. But Myrna didn't bat an eye. She knew that she and Dennis would be fine because they had made a ton of money throughout their 42-year marriage by owning multiple successful businesses, from a chain of pharmacies to a Ford car dealership that Dennis owned with his son. But a few years earlier, Dennis had seen the writing on the wall when it came to the country's economy. So he had sold his businesses before things got too bad, and he had walked away with enough money for him and Myrna to be set for the rest of their lives without having to work. But the truth was, Dennis and Myrna actually loved to work, kind of independent of making money, so they weren't quite ready to just full-on retire. And so after selling his companies, Dennis had returned to his old job as a pharmacist, and Myrna worked at a local middle school as a substitute teacher. And so on this Friday morning, because of his work commitments, Dennis didn't have time to read beyond just the first few pages of the newspaper. After putting the paper down, Dennis finished his breakfast, then gave his wife a kiss on the cheek and told her he loved her, and then he walked out the front door. Once outside, Dennis climbed into his truck and began the 40-mile drive to the nearby town where he worked at this local pharmacy. And while Dennis made his commute, Myrna cleaned up the kitchen and then headed out to work herself. And as she drove the short distance to West Salem Middle School, she passed by all these mini mansions that were just like hers, with wide, well-manicured lawns, and then she drove by the neighborhood golf course and banquet hall. Myrna couldn't picture a better place for her and Dennis to grow old together, a small community filled with friends where she always felt comfortable and safe. And she loved how close her neighborhood was to the rest of her family. Dennis and Myrna had 2 grown children who also had children of their own, and Myrna thought there was nothing better than having the family over and spending time with the grandkids she adored. Myrna finally arrived at the middle school, and she went inside and walked down a long hall to the classroom where she had been assigned that day. She opened the door, and the faces of the students lit up. Myrna was the kids' favorite substitute teacher. The school day passed quickly for Myrna, and as always, she made each period pass just as quickly for her students by making sure the lessons were actually fun. Myrna had always believed that learning should be an enjoyable experience and not a slog where every minute feels like an hour. Myrna worked that day at the school until around 3 p.m., and then the final bell rang, and she told her class to have a great weekend, and she said she'd be back as their substitute on Monday. Then Myrna headed outside, hopped in her car, and made her way home, and then once there, she did some chores around the house, and when she was done with her housework, she sat down in the home office and logged onto her computer. About 45 minutes later, around 6 p.m., her husband, Dennis, pulled back up to the house after his day of work. He parked his truck and made his way onto the porch, eager to get inside and have dinner with his wife. Dennis opened the door and walked through the hallway toward the kitchen, his keys dangling from his hand, and then Dennis stepped into the kitchen and called out to his wife. And then suddenly, everything went black. Three days later, on Monday at 7:50 a.m., the morning bell rang at West Salem Middle School, marking the beginning of the official day. Students all took their seats in all the classrooms, and the school kind of went quiet as the teachers began their lessons. That is, in every classroom but one. In that one classroom, the chair behind the teacher's desk remained empty, and so the students in that classroom just remained standing up and chatting with each other, aware of the fact that their teacher was not there, but not that worried because they liked having some extra time. However, these students' obvious restlessness caught the ear of an administrator who happened to be walking by the classroom. And the administrator stepped into the room and asked what was going on, and the students said their substitute teacher still hadn't shown up. Concerned, the administrator told the students to wait quietly, and then he returned to the front office to double-check the schedule. This was the class that Myrna Cola had been assigned to teach that week, and apparently she had just not shown up for work and didn't tell anybody. The administrator pulled up Myrna's file and dialed her phone number, but no one answered. So the administrator checked Myrna's emergency contact info, and he found it was her son, Eric. Eric Cola was home with his wife when he got the phone call from the administrator. Eric told the administrator that he had no idea why his mom wouldn't show up for work, but he told him he'd try to get in touch with her and report back as soon as he could. Eric hung up and dialed his mom's cell phone, but it just rang and rang until it went to voicemail. So Eric called his father, who at this point in the morning would have been in his truck on his way to work, and so in theory would have been ready to receive a phone call, but he too did not answer his phone. After both parents didn't pick up, Eric turned to his wife looking concerned and said something wasn't right, that this was totally out of character for his parents to just go completely incommunicado. And so Eric called his sister, Cindy, and asked her if she had had any contact with their parents, but Cindy said that she hadn't talked to them since before the weekend. After Eric ended this call, he told his wife that he was just going to go to his parents' house to see what the heck was going on. And about 10 minutes later, Eric slowed his truck to a stop in front of the house, and he saw his dad's truck was out front. Eric parked, walked up the driveway to the side of the house, and he looked into his parents' 3-car garage, and he could see his mother's car, a Mountaineer, was also parked inside, so his parents had to be home. Eric opened the garage with the opener his parents had given him, he walked past his mother's SUV, and then he opened the unlocked door to the house and stepped inside. And as he walked towards the kitchen, he saw his father. Dennis was lying there, motionless on the kitchen floor. Eric ran to his father, and he saw there was a pool of blood all around him. Eric got down on the floor and grabbed his dad's leg, desperately trying to shake him awake. But not only was Dennis unresponsive, his body was totally stiff. And so in a panic, Eric grabbed his phone and dialed 911, and when the operator answered, he told them as best as he could what he had seen, and the operator, who was very calm, asked Eric if anyone else was in the house. And so Eric, who didn't know, began walking down the hall, and when he looked into the office, he cried out. There was his mother, slumped over the desk at the computer. Her skin had turned purple. The operator calmly asked Eric if his mother was still breathing, and Eric replied that no, she wasn't, that both of his parents had to be dead. A little while after Eric's 911 call, Agent John Christopherson of the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation and members of his team arrived at the Colas house. Christopherson saw 2 deputies from the La Crosse County Sheriff's Department talking to Eric in the front yard. And he saw several of the Colas neighbors standing on their porches, looking completely stunned by all the police activity. I mean, this stuff didn't happen in this neighborhood. Christopherson knew major crime was rare in this community, and a double homicide was basically unheard of. That was a big reason Christopherson and the state police had been brought in to lead this investigation. Agent Christopherson got out of his car, walked across the yard, and introduced himself to the deputies and to Eric. And he let them both know that he'd be back soon to ask some questions. Then he led members of his team into the Colas house. The smell of decomposing bodies hit them immediately, and the smell instantly told them that the victims must have been dead for quite a while. Christopherson walked to the kitchen, and he saw Dennis lying face down on the floor. Dennis was surrounded by a pool of coagulated blood, and he had a hole in the right side of his head. Dennis was still wearing his jacket, and his car keys were clutched tightly in his hand. So Christopherson figured that Dennis must have been shot shortly after he walked through the front door of his house. After looking around the kitchen, Christopherson walked down the hall to the office, where he knew the second victim had been found. He saw Myrna's body hunched over the desk. She had an obvious bullet wound in the back of her head, and her left arm was resting on the computer keyboard, as if she had been typing when someone walked up behind her and shot her. Christopherson turned around and glanced back at the office door. He wondered if the killer had stood there and watched this woman at her computer before shooting her. There was something cold-blooded about the idea, like a predator observing its prey before moving in for the kill. While Christopherson searched the office, a member of the investigative team walked inside and told Christopherson that he needed to see something upstairs. So Christopherson followed the officer up a carpeted staircase, down a hallway, and into Myrna and Dennis's bedroom. It appeared like the room had been ransacked. All of the dresser drawers had been pulled open, but as Christopherson walked across the room to the dresser, he felt like there was something unusual about the bedroom scene. Their dresser drawers had all been pulled out and left open in a way that a robber wouldn't have actually been able to see what was in each drawer, and it didn't look like anyone had actually dug through the drawers or taken anything. So Christopherson wondered if maybe the killer had tried to stage the room to look like a robbery, even though that's not what it was. Christopherson continued to walk around the room, and he quickly found pieces of Myrna's very expensive jewelry just sitting out, untouched, so that only added to his suspicion that the apparent ransacking in the bedroom really had been staged. Christopherson finished searching the room and then made his way down the hall to an upstairs guest room. This room looked untouched. But then, when he opened the door to a walk-in closet inside of this room, something immediately caught the agent's eye. It was a .22 caliber rifle propped up against the wall. Christopherson looked up, and he saw, on a shelf right above the rifle, was an opened box of ammunition. He kneeled down to look closer at the rifle, and he noticed there was an indentation in the carpet nearby that was about the same size and shape as the butt of the gun. It looked like the indentation was where the rifle had been resting, but then just recently, someone must have moved that rifle, and when they returned it, they didn't put it back exactly where they'd found it, in the indentation. Christopherson had a member of his team bag the rifle and the box of ammunition and book them into evidence. Then Christopherson headed downstairs and outside and joined the deputies who were talking to Eric. After telling Eric how sorry he was for his loss, Christopherson said, "Look, I have to ask you right now about what you know, because this is a murder investigation and this needs to move quickly." And so he asked Eric when was the last time he saw his parents alive. Eric said it had been Thursday night, so 4 nights earlier. He had stopped by the house to help his mother do laundry and to help his father replace some boards out on the deck. And before Eric left, Eric told Christopherson that his father had said to him, "I love you, son." And Eric had said back, "Yeah, I love you too, Dad." He said that was the last time they actually spoke. Eric did tell Christopherson that that weekend he had tried calling his parents to invite them to a cookout, but they didn't pick up, so he left a voicemail, and his parents didn't call him back, but he didn't think it was that big of a deal because he knew his parents had plans with friends that weekend. After hearing this, Christopherson asked Eric if he knew of anyone who might have access to his parents' residence. Eric said he couldn't think of anyone specifically, but he did say his parents often kept their doors unlocked. This didn't really surprise Christopherson because that's how safe this community was. But now he wondered if maybe someone had exploited that sense of security and just slipped inside the house through an unlocked door. As Eric continued to speak with Christopherson and the other police officers, Eric's sister, Cindy Cowell, arrived at the property. And as she walked across the yard towards them, Christopherson could tell she'd been crying. After Cindy walked over to them, she gave her brother a hug, and the two of them did their best to comfort each other and also to provide any additional information that might help. but neither of them could think of anyone who might have had a motive to kill their parents. And so this double murder was turning into a total mystery. The next day, the medical examiner performed autopsies on Dennis and Myrna, and the results were far from surprising. Each had been shot in the head. But there was an important detail. The bullet that had struck them in the head was a .22 caliber bullet. And this was an important detail for Kristofferson because it was the same caliber bullet used in the rifle he'd found in the upstairs bedroom closet. And that rifle had clearly been recently moved because of that indentation he saw in the carpet. And Kristofferson thought that if that rifle was the murder weapon, then the killer had to have known Dennis and Myrna well enough to know where they kept that gun. Kristofferson wanted to develop a timeline of the Colas' last day. However, the autopsies did not pinpoint the exact times of their deaths, so he still wasn't even sure what day they had died. But one thing he did know was that Myrna had clearly been using her computer when she was killed, so his team sent Myrna's computer to a forensic data lab where the hard drive could be analyzed for timestamps. And this data revealed that Myrna had begun using her computer at exactly 5:14 p.m. on Friday, May 21st, and her very last keystroke was made at 5:41 p.m. that same evening. And so Kristofferson believed that 5:41 p.m. on May 21st was the exact time of Myrna's death. Then Kristofferson, using this information, figured out when Dennis had left work on that day and how long generally it would take Dennis to drive back home. And based on this, Kristofferson concluded that Dennis most likely got home around 6 p.m. So he estimated that Dennis's time of death was about 20 minutes after his wife's death. So at this point, Kristofferson knew that the Colas had very likely been killed in the early evening of May 21st, 3 days before they were actually discovered. And also, based on the timeline, whoever had shot Myrna had very likely waited inside of the house to then kill Dennis when he walked inside. Kristofferson knew that Dennis and Myrna were well off financially, and they had multiple investments and life insurance policies with very big payouts, so money had to be considered as a potential motive. And investigators soon learned that the beneficiaries of Dennis and Myrna's life insurance policies were their kids, Eric and Cindy, and they stood to inherit over $700,000 each. And so obviously when you include the fact that Eric was the one who found the bodies, this made the kids highly suspicious. And so Kristofferson decided he would speak to them both, but he would start with Eric. And so the day after the discovery of the bodies, Eric arrived at the police station and he sat down across from Kristofferson inside of a small interview room. And Eric appeared to be very grief-stricken, but at the same time, Kristofferson could tell Eric was eager to help. He spoke in a cooperative tone and never came across as defensive. And so the first question Kristofferson asked Eric was, how was his relationship with his parents? Eric said he had always gotten along with both of his parents. He said his father was a great business partner because they worked at that car dealership together, and also they played golf together all the time. Eric said he also made a point to see his mother as much as he could and also help her out around the house because she refused to slow down even though she was almost 70. After that, Kristofferson asked Eric to walk him through what he did all day on Friday, May 21st, which is again the day that Kristofferson believed the two victims were killed. Eric said that day he spent the morning and afternoon doing what he normally did, day trading. Day trading is a form of securities trading where the trader buys stocks and other assets and then sells them the same day, taking advantage of price fluctuations that occur between the opening and closing of the trading day. And Eric would say he was actually a pretty successful day trader, often pulling in between $7,000 and $10,000 a month. The only downside being that it required him to sit at home on his computer for hours and hours on end. After he finally got up from his computer, he left his house to meet up with his friend to help grout and tile a shower. He said he was with that friend until about 5:30 p.m., and then he went to pick up his wife at home because they were going out to celebrate their 16th wedding anniversary. Now, to this point in the interview, it was very cut and dry. Eric is doing his best to be composed, but at this point, Eric just suddenly shook his head and began laughing. Kristofferson was very surprised at this and asked, did I miss something funny? Eric stopped laughing and said, it's not really funny, but I had known about this day, our anniversary, for a long time. We had planned it all out. But as I was going back home that day, I actually realized I totally forgot to buy an actual anniversary gift. And so Eric would explain that he stopped at a retail store called Shopko to buy his wife a hanging plant because he knew his wife loved hanging plants, and he also knew the exact type to get her. And so Eric said he went inside the shop and he browsed the store's garden center for a while, but he didn't actually see the plant that his wife liked. So he drove to a different shop co-location, and he did find the right hanging plant there. And he paid for it, and then drove home, and then he and his wife had gone out for their celebration. And then right after he said that, Eric looked like he had just remembered something out of the blue. And he pulled his wallet out, and he took out a receipt for this plant, and he slid it across the table to Christofferson, saying that he had held on to this receipt in case his wife didn't like the plant, and so she could return it. Christofferson looked at the receipt, and it did confirm that Eric had bought this plant at 6:15 p.m. at the Shopko. After that, Christofferson asked Eric to wait in the interview room while he reached out to Eric's friend to confirm that they really had met up on that Friday to grout and tile the bathroom. And so Christofferson got the friend's number, stepped into the hall, and gave him a call, and the friend confirmed that Eric had left his house around 5:30 that evening. And so at this point, Christofferson concluded that based on Eric's timeline, he didn't really have enough time to have also driven to his parents' house to kill them, between leaving his friend's house and then getting that plant at Shopko. So Christofferson did not think Eric was as likely of a suspect as he originally seemed. So Christofferson walked back into the interview room and asked Eric if he could think of anyone at all, who may have had a reason to harm his parents. Eric hesitated, and then with obvious reluctance in his voice, he said they should look into his sister, Cindy, and her husband, Patrick. When asked to explain why, Eric said that Cindy had been having some very serious financial problems. She was living paycheck to paycheck, earning close to minimum wage, working for a collections agency. Meanwhile, her husband, Patrick, didn't work at all. They had a mortgage and other expenses, and Cindy had been borrowing money from their parents to help make ends meet. In fact, she actually owed her parents tens of thousands of dollars. And then also, Eric said that his sister's husband, Patrick, was just generally kind of a bad guy. And also, Eric knew his parents did not like Patrick at all and often referred to him as a, quote, lazy bum. But Eric said he wasn't sure if his parents even knew just how bad things really were between Cindy and her husband, Patrick. Eric said Patrick had a violent temper and had once pulled a gun on Cindy after she threatened to leave him. Patrick allegedly told Cindy that the only way she'd be leaving him was in a body bag. Christofferson was shocked at this information. If this was true, this was a huge red flag. The idea that Patrick had literally pulled a gun out and actually threatened to kill someone certainly made him a pretty big suspect. But Christofferson kind of tempered his reaction to this and just thanked Eric for coming in and speaking to him. And then after Eric was gone, Christofferson immediately reached out to Cindy to set up a meeting. The following day, Cindy showed up at the station and joined Christofferson in the interview room. And right away, Christofferson could tell Cindy seemed very rattled and sort of nervous. But Christofferson didn't react to that and just thanked her for coming in and reiterated how sorry he was for her loss. His voice was calm and friendly, and he told Cindy there was no reason to be nervous, this was just an interview, not an interrogation. Cindy nodded, but still seemed very nervous. Christofferson began the interview by asking Cindy when was the last time she spoke to her parents. And Cindy said she'd spoken to her father on Friday morning, so the day that Dennis and Myrna were killed. Cindy said during this conversation with her dad, she had talked about her and her husband's mounting financial troubles. She had told her father that she and Patrick had absolutely no money, and to make matters worse, the unemployment check that Patrick was expecting hadn't arrived yet. Cindy said her father had been sort of blunt with her that morning. He criticized her husband for not supporting her and their daughter, and then he told Cindy he would not keep giving her any more money. Cindy looked like she was about to cry. She told Christofferson that her father's rejection was so upsetting for her, and she felt like Eric was the favorite child, the golden boy, while she was just a disappointment to her parents. After that, Christofferson asked her what she had done the rest of that day after she had spoken to her father. Cindy said she'd been at work until about 4:45 p.m. She left the office and stopped at a convenience store to buy some groceries, and then she got home between 5:30 and 6. And once she was home, she spent the rest of the evening with her daughter and husband. Christofferson took down Cindy's work information and said that was all he needed from her for now, and that he would follow up if necessary. After the interview, members of the investigative team went to Cindy's office and obtained her punch cards. And the punch cards would show that yes, Cindy had clocked out at 4:45 p.m. Next, they drove over to the convenience store where Cindy said she had done her grocery shopping, and the manager of that store gave them access to the surveillance footage from that day, and it didn't take investigators long to find Cindy in the video, shopping in the store during the time frame she said she was. And so, just like with her brother, the investigators concluded that basically based on the timeline, there wasn't enough time for Cindy to have gone to her parents' house and killed them. But Agent Christofferson couldn't completely rule Cindy out yet. even if she wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, what's to say her husband, Patrick, the man who apparently had, a temper and had previously drawn a gun on Cindy and threatened her life, who's to say he didn't pull the trigger? And also maybe Cindy was involved somehow with the murder, that she helped coordinate it for Patrick. But before Christofferson jumped to that conclusion and brought Patrick in and really drilled him hard on what he was doing on that day, he first wanted to check to see if Eric's description of Patrick was actually accurate. And what Christofferson learned was Patrick had apparently cheated on Cindy at some point, he abused drugs, and he had difficulty holding down jobs. And because he was currently unemployed, he had a lot of free time and not a lot of money. Christofferson also learned that Myrna did not like Patrick so much that she had warned Cindy that if she stayed married to Patrick, there's a chance that she would just deny her getting her inheritance, that basically Patrick could not touch this money, and that was the reason she wouldn't be getting it. And Patrick was definitely aware of this, and also he was aware that Cindy's parents were apparently about to cut them both off financially. And so it did seem like Patrick had more motive to want Dennis and Myrna dead than anybody else. A few days after the murders, Christofferson, along with an investigator from the sheriff's department, waited for Patrick inside of an interview room. Eventually, another officer led Patrick into the room, and Patrick sat down on the other side of the table. Patrick was very physically imposing. He was tall with broad shoulders, and he had short cropped hair, and he had spent some time in the Marine Corps. But once he was settled in his seat, he made it very clear that he wanted to help the investigators in any way he could. And the investigators actually couldn't help but look at each other really quickly, like they couldn't believe how soft-spoken Patrick seemed. I mean, this guy had this horrible reputation, and right now, he seemed like he was just very cooperative. But Christofferson knew looks can be deceiving, so he got right to the point, and he asked Patrick how he spent his day on Friday, May 21st, the day his in-laws were killed. And Patrick said in a very soft voice that he had spent the day just kind of hanging around the house by himself, watching TV and playing Xbox. After this, the county investigator said to Patrick, that's not exactly an airtight alibi. If he was home by himself, how could anybody corroborate that? Patrick said he understood, but he really was telling the truth. That's what he did on Friday. And then he also said he always had a great relationship with Dennis and Myrna, and he would never do anything to hurt them or to cause his wife any pain. At this point, Christofferson was nearly certain that Patrick was just lying, because basically everyone they had spoken to had said that the in-laws did not get along with Patrick. They called him the lazy bum, and they totally resented him and did not like him. So how could he possibly have a good relationship with them? And so Christofferson didn't waste any time. He leaned in and told Patrick that police had heard his relationship with the victims had been strained, to say the least, and so it seemed very likely that right now, Patrick was lying. Christofferson also pointed out Patrick's weak alibi and the fact that as a former Marine, he would know how to use a gun. Patrick didn't deny any of this and said he did own several firearms, but he said again that he really had been at home playing video games that past Friday, and he really didn't have anything to do with the murders. Christofferson told Patrick that they might have a better idea if he really was telling the truth if he allowed them to search his house. Patrick looked at both investigators, and his voice stayed calm and soft like it had the whole time, and he said yes, he would consent to a search of his home because he had nothing to hide. So not long after this interview, investigators did search Patrick and Cindy's house, and they would find multiple firearms which were confiscated. They also seized Patrick's Xbox and brought it into the crime lab for analysis. Investigators were able to see exactly when the Xbox game console was being used, and it did seem to confirm everything Patrick had said, because the Xbox had been used all day on Friday, suggesting Patrick really had been at home playing video games at the time Myrna and Dennis were murdered. And also, after closer analysis, the guns seized in Patrick and Cindy's house were not the same ones that fired the .22 caliber bullets that killed Dennis and Myrna. And so, just like Eric and Cindy, Patrick suddenly had a solid alibi. The following day, Eric walked outside of his house, he opened up his mailbox, and he found a single item inside. It was a plain white envelope with no postage on it. Eric took the envelope inside of his house, he opened it up, and he looked at the paper that was inside. And when Eric saw what was on it, his face turned pale and he started breathing heavily. His wife walked into the room and saw Eric staring at this note and clenching his jaw and shaking his head, and she asked him, "What's going on? What does the note say?" Eric walked over to his wife and just held the note out for her to read. And in strange, weirdly stilted handwriting were the words, "Fixed you." That's all it said, "Fixed you." Eric's wife immediately picked up her phone and dialed 911. A few minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived at the house and took this strange note into evidence. And also the deputy noticed that Eric was incredibly rattled and could barely talk. In fact, the sheriff's deputy said it seemed like Eric could actually have a heart attack. And as Eric tried to catch his breath, he would tell the deputy that he believed his parents' killer wrote this note, and somehow those two words, "fixed you," meant they were coming for him and his family next. The note forced Christofferson to view this case from a totally new angle. If somebody really did have a vendetta against the Colas and that's why they killed Dennis and Myrna, it did seem entirely possible that they might also target the rest of the Cola family. And so that possibility obviously put way more pressure on Christofferson and his team to solve this case quickly. But the only thing that Christofferson kept coming back to that just seemed like it had to be at the heart of this case was money. Not only did Dennis and Myrna have property, investments, and huge insurance policies before they died, but also Eric had been a successful day trader and had lots of money too. So Christofferson decided he would dig deep as he could into the family's finances, hoping that might point him to a potential killer. And so back at the station, Christofferson and a forensic accountant dug through stacks of Dennis and Myrna's printed bank statements, and also they reviewed the couple's most recent online banking transactions. And as they looked at that recent online activity, something absolutely shocked them. And at first, Christofferson literally couldn't believe what he was looking at, like this had to be a mistake, because it was something so outlandish, it just shouldn't have been there. There was a transaction made on May 22nd, 2010, the day after the murders. The transaction showed a check that was cashed from Dennis's account for $50,000. Now, the name on the signature line of the check was Dennis Cola, but it was the name on the account that this check had been deposited into that really caught the investigators' attention. And suddenly the whole focus of the investigation shifted. Police immediately served a search warrant on this particular person's house, and inside they found a pair of plain white envelopes very similar to the envelope that Eric had found in his mailbox that contained the words "fixed you" on it. And when those envelopes were compared to the one that Eric had received, they contained the same manufacturing defect, proving that the envelope containing that "fixed you" note had come from this individual's house. Then a forensic document examiner looked at that $50,000 check, and he quickly determined that Dennis's signature on this check was a forgery. What's more, the forged handwriting perfectly matched the handwriting on the "fixed you" note. And so now Agent Christofferson was very confident that the person who wrote that note and then also forged the check was Dennis and Myrna's killer. Based on financial records, evidence from the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is what police believe happened to Dennis and Myrna Cola on May 21st, 2010. Around 5:30 p.m., the killer, who was inside of the Cola's house at this point, slowly walked down the hallway in the direction of the home office. They watched Myrna from the hall until they were sure she was totally preoccupied with what she was doing on her computer. Then the killer slowly walked upstairs, entered one of the bedrooms, opened the closet door, and lifted the .22 caliber rifle from where it was resting on the floor. They also reached up and grabbed some ammo from the box on the shelf, then loaded the rifle and walked back downstairs. Then the killer made their way back to the home office, and they looked inside and saw Myrna was still preoccupied with the computer. And so the killer stepped forward into the room, they raised the rifle, aimed it at Myrna's head, and then pulled the trigger. A .22 caliber bullet lodged in Myrna's brain. She died instantly, slumping over her computer, with her fingers still near the last keys she had pressed. Confident that Myrna was dead, the killer crossed the room and closed the blinds. Then they walked back into the hallway, went down to the kitchen, and sat down at the table, and began to wait. About 20 minutes later, the killer heard Dennis's truck pull up outside. The killer heard the sound of the truck door opening and closing, and then the sounds of footsteps getting louder as Dennis approached the front of the house. At this point, the killer slowly got up and moved towards the back of the kitchen and put their back against the wall, sort of out of view, and continued to wait. A moment later, the killer heard Dennis's footsteps now inside of the house, his keys jangling in his hand. Then the killer saw Dennis walk into the kitchen, and immediately they raised their rifle, aimed it at Dennis's head, and fired. Dennis was dead before he even hit the ground. The killer stared at the body on the floor, and then walked back upstairs and returned the rifle to the closet, failing to notice they were not placing it in the exact spot where it had been before. After that, the killer walked to Dennis and Myrna's bedroom and opened up the dresser drawers to make it look like the home had been robbed. Then the killer opened up the drawer on the nightstand, tore out a check from Dennis's checkbook, and then wrote themselves a $50,000 check and forged Dennis's signature. The killer slipped the check into their pocket, walked back downstairs, left the house, and drove to a Shopko store to buy a hanging plant for an anniversary gift, making sure to keep the receipt to help corroborate the alibi they knew they would need. Dennis and Myrna's own son, Eric Kola, had been their killer. It would turn out Eric had only visited one Shopko store that day to buy a plant, not the two stores like he had told police. And so when detectives obtained the surveillance footage from the Shopko Eric claimed to have visited first, before going to the second one and buying the plant, well, they expected to see him browsing the garden center in this first shop, but the investigators spent hours and hours reviewing the footage from multiple cameras inside and outside the store, but there was no trace of Eric anywhere. And investigators knew that if he had not gone to that store and only went to the second one, well, he would easily have enough time to kill his parents. And so his alibi began to fall apart. And then, when investigators delved deeper into the Kola's financial records, they found that forged $50,000 check, and it was made out to Eric. And then also, when investigators began probing Eric's personal finances, they quickly discovered that Eric had been lying to them. Eric was not raking in $7,000 to $10,000 a month from day trading as he claimed. In fact, he was in serious financial trouble. His day trading had been successful in the beginning, but then the economy had tanked, and Eric's financial position plummeted, leaving him desperately broke and $150,000 in debt. But Eric continued keeping up appearances. He drove luxury cars, spoiled his kids, and retained membership at an exclusive country club. He presented himself to friends as this financial wizard, but all the while, he was actually borrowing huge sums of money from his father and then losing it on the stock market. Investigators had learned from Dennis's colleagues that Dennis was an extraordinarily generous man, the kind of guy who would give you the shirt off his back if he thought you were in need. But Dennis's generosity had its limits. He had reached the end of his rope with his kids because he had given Eric hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he had helped pay Cindy's mortgage while her husband sat at home unemployed playing video games. And in fact, only days before the murders, Dennis had told a work colleague at the pharmacy that he was officially cutting off his children financially. Enough was enough. When police confronted Eric about the forged $50,000 check, Eric explained that his father had given him a blank check the day before he was killed, and Eric had deposited it on Saturday, having no idea his parents were dead. But police didn't believe that, because Dennis had just told his colleague that he planned to stop giving his children money. So police searched Eric's home, and they found the envelopes that matched the envelope from the Fixed You note. Eric had written that note himself and put it in his own mailbox. And so by this point, police were very sure Eric had killed his parents, and they had enough probable cause to arrest him. Police believe Eric Kola murdered his mother and father just so he could use the inheritance money to pull himself out of debt. The case against Eric was entirely circumstantial, but it was strong enough that a jury found him guilty on 2 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. Eric did not receive a dime of his parents' estate, but his 2 children did inherit $740,000, which they split between them. Eric continues to maintain his innocence. In the fall of 2005, 29-year-old lawyer Anna Sumner leaned her elbows against her large wooden desk and stared at her computer screen. It was hard not to let her mind wander. She could see downtown Atlanta, Georgia, right from her office window. Anna yawned and stretched and then forced her eyelids to stay open. It was already 5 p.m., but she still had an important brief to finish before she could go home. Her attention wandered again, this time to the framed diplomas that hung on her wall. She had an undergraduate degree from Princeton, and she had received her law degree from Duke. She'd studied very hard in school and now had worked her way up the ranks at a very prestigious law firm. She was proud of everything she'd accomplished. Anna leaned back in her chair and kicked off her high heels. She was exhausted. Then again, she was always exhausted. In high school, she used to skip hanging out with friends just to go to bed early, which left her feeling totally isolated. During college, she routinely skipped breakfast to sleep in, and then showed up to class so hungry she couldn't even focus. Once, she'd flown cross-country for a friend's wedding, and then accidentally slept through the entire thing. Finding the energy to get through law school had been a constant struggle, and it was even harder as a young lawyer at a big firm where so much was expected of new people. Sometimes she feared that her constant fatigue was damaging the career she had sacrificed so much for. It was beyond frustrating. Anna had slept for at least 12 hours the night before, yet here she was, not feeling rested. It was like she was moving through a fog at all times. She always needed more sleep, but she knew she needed to keep working. Anna stood up and shook her arms, trying to get her blood moving. She opened her eyes as wide as she could. She shook her head back and forth and sat back down, determined to finish her work. But as soon as she started to type, her eyelids grew heavy again, and Anna nodded off, her cheek resting on the keyboard. The next thing Anna knew, she was slowly waking up. Her back ached from being hunched over in her chair. Her computer screen had gone to sleep too. She shook the mouse and the screen lit up, and she looked at the time. It was 6 a.m. Anna had just slept for 13 hours. She was completely disoriented, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and her brief was not finished. Anna immediately felt a knot form in her throat. She had been successfully hiding her sleepiness problem ever since she was a teenager when it began. She'd always been able to arrange her schedule to accommodate her constant need to sleep. But now that she had a job with a lot of responsibilities, she just didn't have that same flexibility. Anna had always prided herself on having a good work ethic and self-control, but now she realized that this was something she really just couldn't control. Sometimes when Anna felt really tired, she would think to herself, if I don't sleep right now, I feel like I could actually die. She knew that was not normal. This problem had gone on long enough, and it wasn't going to get better unless she sought out some help. A few days later, Anna drove to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center in Atlanta. It was inside an old, faded building undergoing significant renovations. In fact, there was still construction going on outside. Anna plugged her ears as she walked past jackhammers slamming into concrete. She checked in, and a few moments later, a gray-haired, round-faced doctor walked her back to a large exam room with chairs and a bed. He adjusted his glasses and then introduced himself as Dr. David Rye, the lead neurologist at the clinic. He motioned for Anna to take a seat and asked her about her symptoms. And she told him that she basically craved sleep the same way a drug addict craves a fix. No matter how much she slept, she never felt rested, and the constant exhaustion was totally debilitating. Dr. Rye nodded understandingly and suggested they begin with a very basic test. He asked Anna to simply take a nap, right there in the exam room. And so Anna laid down on the bed. She could still hear the loud construction noises going on outside, but it didn't bother her. Within moments, she was asleep. But just a few minutes later, Dr. Rye shook her awake, and then he diagnosed her with a disorder called hypersomnia. This is a catch-all term for extreme, unexplained sleepiness. It's thought that up to 5% of the entire population experiences it, though rarely at the level Anna was. So while it was a diagnosis, it really wasn't that specific. But for Anna, who'd never seen a doctor for her sleep problems before, having any diagnosis was progress. And she was even more optimistic when Dr. Rye suggested a treatment plan. He explained that in most cases, extreme tiredness is caused by a lack of energy-promoting chemicals in the brain, with names like dopamine and norepinephrine. It's like having a car with no gas in the tank. So he prescribed stimulants for Anna. These medications increase the level of these energy-promoting chemicals the same way that caffeine does. For patients like Anna, it can feel like they have a full tank of gas again. And Anna was so excited about her stimulants that after she left the doctor's office, she went straight to the pharmacy. When she got there, a pharmacist handed her a paper bag with a couple of prescription bottles inside, and Anna didn't waste any time getting her first dose. Sitting in her car in the parking lot, she opened one of the bottles, shook a pill into her hand, and swallowed it. She couldn't wait to feel better. A few months later, Anna grabbed a stack of papers off the desk in her office. Her hands shook slightly as she slipped the papers into her shoulder bag. She stood up from her desk chair, and suddenly a wave of nausea washed over her. She'd taken her prescription stimulants that morning and had been taking them every day since Dr. Rye prescribed them. In some ways, the stimulants were working. She could get through a full day of work without needing a nap, but the side effects from the medication were terrible. She felt jittery and sick to her stomach, like she'd had way too many cups of coffee. She was losing weight because she never had any appetite. And even though she had felt kind of okay for a while on this medication, she was now starting to crave sleep again. As she walked outside and unlocked her car, All Anna could think about was getting home and going to bed. She got into her car, pulled out her phone, and called Dr. Rye. She told him about the side effects she was feeling and now how her craving for sleep was starting to come back. Dr. Rye assured her that this was actually normal. He told Anna her body was building up a tolerance to the drugs and he'd simply prescribe her a higher dose. Anna was nervous about this. The stimulants were already giving her such bad side effects, and she thought taking more would really only make her feel worse. But at the same time, the medication was the only thing allowing her to make it through the day. So Anna agreed to the higher dose. She hung up, drove to the pharmacy, and picked up more medication. One year later, on a Friday in April of 2007, Anna was wrapping up her work for the week when the phone on her desk rang. It was her boss. He wanted her to come up to his office before she went home. Anna's hand trembled as she set down the receiver. She wasn't sure if the trembling was from a side effect of the stimulants or from nerves from what her boss just asked her to do. She knew what this conversation was going to be about, and she'd been dreading it for months. Anna had begun missing entire days of work without warning and without explanation. Even though she was constantly taking all of her stimulants, it wasn't uncommon for Anna to still literally sleep days away. Sometimes she'd go to bed and sleep for 20, 25, or even 30 hours straight. It didn't matter how many alarms she set either. Anna slept through all of them, only waking up when her body finally let her. Anna got up from her chair and her legs felt heavy. Even now, with adrenaline coursing through her body, all Anna wanted to do was sleep. It took all her strength to trudge down the hall to her boss's corner office. She knocked on the door, and then, in a somber tone, her boss asked her to come inside. Anna sat down across from his desk and tried to stay composed. She felt angry at her body for betraying her. She'd put in so many years of hard work, and she was sure that it was all about to slip away. But Anna's boss didn't fire her. He reassured Anna that he valued her contributions, but he was really concerned about her health. Though Anna rarely talked about it, her boss was quite aware of her sleep issue, and so he recommended that she take a 6-month leave of absence so she could get to the bottom of it. Anna didn't want to do this. She wanted to keep working, but she knew that taking this leave of absence was probably the right thing to do. If she couldn't be consistently relied on, she wouldn't be helping the firm, her clients, or herself. So she thanked her boss for understanding and promised to do everything she could to get back to work soon. The next afternoon, Anna was lying on her couch at home, trying to make sense of her struggles. She sipped on a cup of coffee and tried to watch TV, but as usual, she couldn't stop herself from nodding off. This time, though, waking up was worse than ever. Her head was pounding and the light coming in through the blinds seemed overwhelmingly bright. She had sharp hunger pangs in her stomach and her joints felt stiff and her muscles were weak and shaky. It took all her effort just to roll onto her side. She saw the TV had shut off and the cup of coffee she'd just been drinking was now totally cold and the cream inside of the coffee was clearly rotten and curdled at the top of the cup. Anna was confused and grabbed her phone on the coffee table and she checked the time and date. And what she saw literally did not seem possible. According to the time, Anna had just slept for 53 hours straight. It had been over 2 days since she'd laid down on the couch, but it felt like, a second had passed. Staring at the date and time on her phone, she felt sick. Her symptoms were really starting to frighten her. How long would she sleep the next time? A week? More? How could she live anything like a normal life if this was what happened to her? She called Dr. Rye's office immediately, and he thankfully had an immediate appointment available. As Anna dragged herself off the couch and walked out to her car, she felt weak and clumsy. Walking was like trying to pull her body through sludge these days. She gingerly lowered herself into the driver's seat and then drove straight to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center. Before long, Anna was in that familiar exam room, sitting across from Dr. Rye. He seemed surprised to see her, but when she told him about falling asleep for 53 hours straight, his eyes went wide. Dr. Rye knew that spending so much time asleep could actually be dangerous. It meant Anna wasn't eating, drinking water, or exercising for days at a time. In the long term, this could lead to malnutrition, dehydration, and muscle atrophy. If she wasn't able to take care of herself, her body would eventually quit working. However, Dr. Rai said he did have an idea for what they could do next. It was a last-ditch effort and something he would not recommend unless it was absolutely an emergency, and clearly this was that. There was a test that could help them figure out what was causing her to sleep so much, but for it to be accurate, she needed to stop taking all the stimulants he'd been prescribing. Anna leaned back in her seat after hearing this. She knew the stimulants weren't perfect. No matter the dosage, she always needed more, and she was still sleeping way too much. But at the same time, the idea of not taking them scared her. If she could sleep for 53 hours with stimulants in her system, what would happen to her without stimulants? But in Dr. Rai's opinion, getting rid of the stimulants might be the only way to figure out what was happening inside of her brain. It would take about a month for the drugs to clear her system, so the doctor scheduled an appointment for a month from then, in May. Until then, the doctor explained to Anna that she really needed to be careful. Once she stopped taking these stimulants, she shouldn't drive, just in case she fell asleep behind the wheel, and she should have someone looking after her, making sure she ate, drank, and moved around every day. Anna realized that what the doctor was saying was, without these stimulants, she could not live alone anymore. And so, after she made it home from the clinic, she called her parents, who lived in Mississippi, and she told them she needed their help. Her parents immediately agreed, and her mother said she'd come to stay with Anna in Atlanta for as long as she needed. Anna was relieved to hear this, but at the same time, she was so tired she could barely function. She felt like she was literally sleeping her life away. A month later, in May of 2007, Anna's mom helped her get into the passenger seat of her car. With no stimulants in her system, Anna felt even more lethargic and totally confused. All she knew on this day was that they were going to the sleep clinic to see Dr. Rai. The whole ride, Anna sat with her head leaned against the window, watching trees and buildings blur together as she slipped in and out of consciousness. When they got to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center, Anna felt so stiff and heavy that her mom had to help her get out of the car. Anna could barely keep her eyes open as she leaned on her mom's arm, and then she shuffled her way into the clinic, feeling like she had cinder blocks stuck to her feet. Dr. Rai met Anna in the waiting area and walked her back to an exam room. They sat down, Dr. Rai in a chair and Anna on the bed. And as soon as Anna was sitting down, she started to feel herself beginning to fall asleep. As she struggled to stay awake, Dr. Rai explained the procedure they'd be doing that day. He said sleep was largely controlled by a person's brain. The brain uses nerves and chemicals to send messages through the rest of the body, and if the balance of these chemicals is thrown off, it could make someone sleep far too little or far too much. Dr. Rai thought this could be what was happening to Anna, but he needed to analyze the fluid inside her spinal cord to be sure. This meant he would need to insert a needle into the base of her spine and withdraw some of the fluid, a procedure known as a spinal tap. Dr. Rai instructed Anna to lay down on the bed in the fetal position with her back facing him. Then he injected a local anesthetic near her spine, and Anna's back went numb. Then Anna began to feel pressure and a burning sensation as Dr. Rai inserted the needle into her spine and removed a sample of her cerebrospinal fluid. When the procedure was over, Dr. Rai told Anna it would take a few days for the results to come back. And so Anna stood, her back numb and her whole body exhausted, and she shuffled out to the waiting room where her parents were sitting. Then the parents helped Anna out to the car, they got inside, and they drove back to Anna's house in Atlanta. Anna barely made it inside before she collapsed into bed and fell asleep. A few days later, Dr. Rai was getting ready to leave work to head home when one of his assistants rushed inside and told him that the results of Anna's test had come in. Dr. Rai adjusted his glasses and then peered down at the data on his computer screen. He reviewed the chemical breakdown of Anna's cerebrospinal fluid, and what he saw shocked him so much that he called over other doctors to take a look. Every sleep specialist at the clinic was totally surprised. The results were so bizarre that one doctor even started laughing at the absurdity of the numbers they were seeing. They had literally never seen anything like this. But while the other doctors stood in disbelief, Dr. Rai felt a mixture of hope and unease. He had seen results like this before, in an Italian sleep study from the 1990s. In that study, a group of people who had symptoms similar to Anna's were given an experimental drug that cured their sleepiness. It was a drug that Dr. Rye had on hand, which meant he might be able to use it to cure Anna too. But there were problems that made Dr. Rye hesitant. That Italian study had been discredited after the research was found to have some serious issues. Plus, the drug used in that study to cure their sleepiness was never approved by the Food and Drug Administration to treat sleep disorders, and it could cause bad side effects like seizures, so giving it to Anna would definitely be a risk. But faced with Anna's spinal tap results, Dr. Rye thought the risk was worth it, and so he called Anna and told her that he might be able to treat her sleepiness, but they need to do one more test. The next month, in June of 2007, Anna came back to the Emory Clinic. She'd been off the stimulants now for 2 months, and it felt like her body was close to shutting down on her, like she'd never be able to do anything except sleep again. Every footstep she took was a total battle. She dragged herself into the exam room and crawled into the bed. She felt a nurse lift her arm, swab near her wrist, and then jab her with an IV needle. Anna was vaguely aware of other movement in the room. Multiple nurses were standing by, just in case Anna had a bad reaction to the drug, like a seizure or worse. Anna watched as Dr. Rye rolled a screen into the room. Everything looked slightly blurry to her. She heard Dr. Rye say they were doing a test to measure her brain's reaction time, and then he put a remote in her hand and told her to press the button as soon as she saw numbers appear on this screen. Anna tried to follow his instructions, but at the same time, she felt herself drifting in and out of consciousness, and so when a number popped up, she would press the button like she was told to, but she could tell by the look on Dr. Rye's face that she was not doing a good job. After the test was over, Dr. Rye told Anna that her reaction times were similar to someone who had just been up all night, or who had been drinking very heavily. And so now that they had these control results, they could try the medication that Dr. Rye hoped would help her. Anna watched as Dr. Rye put something into her IV bag. The liquid dripped through the tube into her arm and into her bloodstream. But Anna didn't feel any better. Her head felt like a lead weight. Her eyes were so dry that they burned, and the whole room seemed foggy. It took everything in her not to slump over and let her eyes close. For a moment, she had a horrible feeling that this new treatment was not going to work. She would never be able to hold a job or even live by herself again. Then she heard Dr. Rye's voice at her side saying he was going to try a higher dose of this drug. Anna struggled to take a deep breath. She waited for something to happen. Then her eyelids snapped open. The room came into focus, and Anna felt like she could hear and see again, and she didn't feel a desperate urge to sleep. Dr. Rye ran the reaction time test again, and Anna didn't have to work to focus on the screen. The reflex test that had seemed impossible before felt very simple now. When they were finished, Anna looked up at Dr. Rye, close to tears, and she told him she felt alive. For the first time in her adult life, Anna felt truly awake. Dr. Rye watched Anna for a moment. In all the time he'd known her, he'd never seen her look this alert. She sat up straight, her eyes were clear and focused, and she was smiling at him. He couldn't help but smile back. It was incredible to see how much of a difference this drug was making. Dr. Rye sat down next to Anna and told her that he had never seen a patient like her before. Her brain was basically full of naturally occurring anesthesia. He explained that there's a chemical messenger in everyone's brains known as GABA, G-A-B-A, that helps regulate sleep. Many sleep aids and drugs used for surgical anesthesia make the brain respond more strongly to GABA. The stronger the response, the sleepier a person gets, Dr. Rye said. And the reason Anna's doctors were so shocked by her test results was because her naturally occurring GABA activity levels were as high as a person who was about to go into surgery. Every day of her life, 24 hours a day, Anna was walking around with the same level of sedation as a person about to have all their wisdom teeth removed. Dr. Rye watched Anna's jaw drop as she realized that she hadn't just been tired for most of her life. Her own brain had been literally knocking her out. This drug that Dr. Rye had given her was called flumazenil. Usually, flumazenil is used in hospitals to help people who are overdosing on sedatives or having trouble waking up from anesthesia. It's an emergency antidote for people whose GABA activity is too high. So for Anna, whose GABA activity was always too high, Flamazanil made her brain function like a healthy person's brain. But the FDA never approved flamazanil for excessive sleepiness. The drug only came as an intravenous medication for use in hospitals, and the effects wore off really quickly. Anna would need to have intravenous injections every few hours to stay awake, and that just wasn't possible from a practical standpoint. So Dr. Rai worked with Anna and the drug maker over the next 8 months to get an exemption from the FDA that would allow her to take a daily flamazanil pill to prevent her sleepiness. The medication completely changed Anna's life. She's since gone back to work, been promoted to partner at the big prestigious law firm in Atlanta, and is enjoying what she calls, quote, the luxury of life. On the morning of June 18, 2016, a 45-year-old hiker named Zhang Shenpeng stood at the entrance to the famous Maclehose Wilderness Trail in southern China. He reached into his backpack, pulled out his phone, aimed it at the trail, and took a photo. Now, this trail was very beautiful, which is why he was taking a photo of it, but it also had a reputation for being a very dangerous trail. It was located in an area called the Sai-Kung Peninsula, and the trail itself was about 100 kilometers long, or 62 miles, and it went through forests and mountains and streams, and the weather along this trail was very unpredictable, with sudden storms rolling in and just wreaking havoc. But Zhang was feeling very confident about this hike because he himself was an experienced hiker. While he maybe hadn't done this particular trail, he had hiked similar trails, and also the weather appeared to be holding up. However, before Zhang could even take a step onto this trail, the sky suddenly turned this dark greenish hue, and there was a loud thunderclap. I mean, basically instantly, there was this massive storm overhead. Zhang couldn't believe it. He just stood there watching as this unbelievable storm rolled in, wondering what he should do. I mean, again, he had not prepared for a storm. It was supposed to be nice out. But as he's kind of weighing whether or not he should just turn around and head back home because it was now too dangerous, the sky, just as suddenly as this all began, cleared. And it was suddenly beautiful and bright out, and the storm was gone. Now, at first, Zhang was not entirely convinced that the storm was now just magically gone, and so for a few minutes, he just stood there waiting in case it came back. But it didn't. The sky remained beautiful and clear. And so eventually, Zhang posted that photo he had taken of the trail, and he captioned it with something to the effect of, very strange weather out here, but I'm continuing my hike. And then after posting the photo, he put his phone away and began walking down the Maclehose Trail. At first, as Zhang headed off into the forest, he made good time. It was warm out, but not too hot, and his pack was fairly light, and also the views were just stunning. Every time he came to a rise on the trail, he could look out and see the waves of the South China Sea, and the air was so clear and crisp. I mean, it was a really relaxing and beautiful place to be. Certainly a big change from what he was used to, which was the noise and crowds of the city. And so Zhang just continued on his hike, stopping periodically to take more photos. But after about an hour of this hike, when things were still going really well, Zhang reached this fairly steep incline on the trail, and he began walking up it. There had been past inclines on the trail, and he had been fine. But as he began maneuvering up this particular incline, he began to feel kind of woozy. In fact, more specifically, he began to feel like the air all around him was getting really hot, like somebody was turning up the temperature all around him. And so Zhang, he stopped as he was making his way up this incline to kind of catch his breath. But as he did that, the heat just got worse and worse. He became delirious. And as he was almost towards the top of this hill, it was like he just couldn't go any further. And the world began to spin all around him. And before long, he was tumbling to the ground and blacking out. The next thing Zhang became aware of was the feeling of grass pressed up against his cheek. He was laying on the trail. So he kind of opened his eyes, and he sat up for a second. He was very disoriented. He didn't know how long he had been out for. He figured it was only a couple of minutes. But as he kind of got his bearings, the first thing he noticed is the sky was now totally dark. And when he had passed out, it was broad daylight. And so he's thinking, that can't possibly be true. I can't have been here for hours. That's not possible. And so he began to think to himself like, oh, I guess another storm has rolled in. That's why the sky is so dark. It's not nighttime. But then when he reached into his bag and pulled out his phone and saw the time and saw it was 8 o'clock at night, he realized there was no storm. It really is nighttime. He had been unconscious on this trail for apparently like 12 hours. And so as Zhang just stared at his phone in disbelief, his phone began to ring, and it was his wife. And so Zhang's thinking, oh my goodness, I'm supposed to be home right now. My wife is definitely worried about me. And so pretty quickly he kind of composed himself, even though again, he has no idea what's happening here. And he answers the call, and as cheerful as he could, he told his wife that everything was fine, he was just running late and he would be home soon, and so she said okay. And then after Zhang hung up with her, he put his phone back in his backpack and pulled out a flashlight, and then he stood up and kind of checked himself over for cuts and scrapes and bruises. He had no idea what condition he was in here, but after checking himself over, he seemed okay. He was still very disoriented and confused, but physically he was okay. And then, again, even though he doesn't understand what's happening here, he's just thinking, okay, I've got to turn around, get back to the car, and get home as quickly as possible. And so he slung his backpack, and with his flashlight out in front of him, he just started hoofing it back down the trail in the direction of his car. Now, as Zhang walked along, he was feeling very unsettled, but he kept telling himself that, independent of whatever's happened here, he was going to be home soon and everything was going to be fine. However, not long into his return trip towards his car, he began to get this unbelievably bad feeling, like something was just totally wrong here. And as he began having this feeling, he suddenly took stock of the fact that the forest he was in, which had been so alive with life and sound and everything, was now completely silent. No insects, no animals. The stream nearby was making no sound. It was like he was in a void. And it was so eerie. And he stopped and just listened, and it was like the whole world was on mute. And so Zhang, who now was starting to feel scared, just began scanning his flashlight all around him, not even sure what he was looking for. But as he did, he had another realization. Suddenly the area he was in did not look familiar at all. He had only walked maybe several paces away from where he had just fallen to the trail and passed out. But now as he looked around, it was like he was in a totally different section of the forest. He looked back where he had fallen, and even in the grass where he would have been, it was untouched. There was no impression on the ground from where he would have been laying for 12 hours, like he'd been transported somewhere else without knowing it. Now, when Zhang spoke to his wife on the phone, he was very careful not to alarm her, even though he had sort of a growing sense of panic inside of him. But now, the whole situation was sort of out of hand. He really didn't understand what was happening, and he knew he needed help. And so he reached into his backpack to pull out his phone to call for help, except when he reached into his bag, there was nothing there. His phone was gone, his supplies were gone, the bag was totally empty, even though literally minutes before it had been full. Like there was no way he just randomly lost this stuff. It had been there, and now it was gone. And so Zhang desperately looked on the ground with his flashlight, and he walked back in the direction where he believed he had fallen, even though it didn't look like the same place. He's looking all over the place like, maybe he did drop his stuff, but he didn't. It was just gone. And so now, really feeling scared, Zhang just completely lost his composure and began screaming at the top of his lungs for help. But he heard nothing in response, just silence. And then not long after that, Zhang's head began to feel heavy again, and then he sank to the ground, put his head in the dirt, and he closed his eyes. When Zhang woke up, it was bright out, and he also was now magically back at the original spot where he had passed out on that steep incline. And the first thing he did as soon as he came to is he reached into his bag, hoping that his phone and other supplies would have just materialized by now. But no, when he reached inside the bag, it was still empty. And so on the one hand, Zhang still is like, what is going on here? I don't understand what's happening. And then on the other, he was also becoming acutely aware that because he doesn't have his phone, he can't call for help. Like he's stuck out here. And so he's wondering, like, what is he going to do here? And then it dawns on him that, it's been at least several hours since he last spoke to his wife, and she was expecting him home the night before. And so by now, certainly, because he hasn't come home, she must have called the police. And so maybe there was already a search party out here looking for him. And so suddenly feeling kind of hopeful that that was actually happening, Zhang, despite his confusion and disorientation here, just scooped up his backpack, put it on, and began walking down the trail back in the direction towards his car. And as he walked, Zhang periodically would call out, hoping that again, some searchers or other hikers were nearby who would hear him and come to his aid. But after hiking for over an hour, he still had not reached his car. The forest was still eerily silent, like everything was silent. He hadn't seen or heard anybody else. He's totally alone here. And so Zhang started to wonder if maybe his best bet was not to try to hike out of here, but instead to just stay put and wait for, hopefully, the search party, if there was one out there, to come find him, or maybe some other hiker to come find him. However, as he was considering this, he looked up ahead where the trail kind of turned, and he saw there was this pond, a pond he had not seen on the way in, but nonetheless, there was a pond basically right over there. And from his perspective, he could see kind of through the trees on the other side of the pond appeared to be a person. Zhang suddenly felt this enormous sense of relief. Here was the person who was going to help him and get him out of here. And so Zhang began walking towards this person, and as he did, he cupped his hands and he called out a hello to get this person's attention. Now, when Zhang did this, he believed this person would either, one, hear him, turn around and see what Zhang wanted, or two, they wouldn't hear him, and they would just continue to stand there with their back to him. But neither of those things happened. When Zhang called out this very hearty hello, this person just instantly began sprinting away from Zhang without even turning to look at him. They just began taking off into the trees. And Zhang, he's thinking like this is a crisis for him. He has no idea what's happening here. This is the first person he's seen. He needs them. And so instinctively, Zhang just took off running after them, calling out the whole time, trying to reassure them that he was not a threat. He didn't mean to scare them. He needs their help. And so he gets to the pond. He runs around the perimeter. He can still see this person running off into the woods. And Zhang, like he's so exhausted from the lack of water and food, he's not feeling his best, but somehow through adrenaline alone, he starts gaining on this person. And eventually he closes the distance on this person as they're weaving through the trees. And suddenly this person just stops. And they don't turn around to look at Zhang, they just stop in the middle of the woods. And Zhang, he almost barrels into them because he had been running so quickly, and he just stops. And he's staring at the back of this person who still has not turned around to look at him at any point. And Zhang says to them, "Please, I need your help." And Zhang, he's panting, he's totally out of breath. And this person who's been running at top speed the whole time, they're not out of breath. They're not even moving. They're stationary, just with their back to Zhang. And suddenly, as Zhang is staring at this person, realizing that something feels off here, the person begins to turn around to look at him. And as they do, Zhang suddenly feels this incredible sense of dread. Like he chased this person down, he needs their help, but now that they're turning around to face him, something feels wrong and he doesn't want to see him. Something's off here. And then the person fully turns around and looks at Zhang, and Zhang is suddenly so terrified of what he sees, he holds his breath and just stays there frozen to the spot staring. He can't believe what he's looking at. This was not a person. This was some sort of shadowy figure with no face, and it was now staring directly at Zhang. And Zhang, again, he's so scared he can't move, he's holding his breath, he's just looking right back at them, and then suddenly this figure takes an aggressive step toward Zhang, and then another, and another, until suddenly they're inches away from Zhang, and Zhang is so terrified, he just closes his eyes, expecting to die at any second, and then when he opens his eyes, the figure's just gone. For about 5 minutes, Zhang just stood there, shaking in utter disbelief of what he had just experienced. I mean, this whole thing had been terrifying, but this specific interaction with this shadow figure was horrifying, and he had no idea how to process it. But at the same time, after a few minutes, Zhang's thinking to himself, I don't want to stay around here to try to figure out what's going on. I need to get out of here. And so Zhang, finally, after mustering the courage, he turns to start walking back towards the pond and back up to the trail. But when he turns around, the pond isn't there anymore. It's just this endless expanse of trees. The pond should have been right there, and it's gone. And also, when Zhang took off running after this shadow figure, it was daylight. And now, it's darkness. It's total darkness. And so once again, Zhang has somehow gone to a new location and jumped through time, several hours at least, with no idea how that had even happened. And also, as he's having this realization that once again, it's like space-time has changed all around him, he starts to have that heaviness in his head, things start to swim all around him, and before long, he's fallen to the ground and he's closing his eyes. When Zhang woke up again, it was now suddenly bright out. So again, more time has passed. He was not just passed out for a minute or two. It was several hours at least. And also, Zhang was now magically laying right next to the pond that had vanished the night before after this figure had showed up. And so at this point, Zhang is seriously thinking to himself that he must have lost his mind. That's what's happening here. He's gone insane. Or does he have some horrible head injury that's like causing hallucinations or something? Like, he doesn't know. But at the same time, all he can do at this point is just get up, try to get back to the trail, and try to get back to his car and get back home. That's all he can do. And so that's what he did. Zhang made his way back up to the trail and began walking down the trail in the direction that he believed was back towards his car. But after hiking for a while, things did not look any more familiar. It was like he was hiking down a brand new trail that he had never been on before. The forest continued to be eerily silent, and every time he called out for help, he got nothing in response. And then eventually, Zhang reached a section of the trail that kind of sloped down, and when he got there and he looked out ahead of him, he saw down below there was this huge cemetery. Now, Zhang had studied this entire area before coming out on this hike, and he knew there was no cemetery in the middle of the McLehose Trail. Like, this can't be here. But remember, by this point, Zhang has seen and experienced things that he cannot understand. So he doesn't even know what's real and what's not anymore. And so as he's looking at the cemetery, he told himself this has got to be some hallucination. This can't be here. But after walking down the hill and entering the cemetery, he reached out and touched the headstones, and they were very real. This cemetery absolutely, for right now anyways, was real and right in front of him. And as he looked at the dates on these headstones, he could tell the cemetery was at least 200 years old. And so as Zhang is taking in this new information, he looks up and he sees a couple hundred meters away from him is a group of what appears to be people clustered around a grave. And for a moment, Zhang feels this unbelievable sense of relief. Here we go. There's some people here. You know, they're visiting their relatives. They can help me. But before Zhang ran over there and asked for their help, he watched one of them sort of turn their bodies, and they looked back at Zhang. And instantly, Zhang's body was overcome with terror once again. Because this person was not a person. This was a faceless, dark figure, just like the one he had encountered near the pond. And there was this horrible sense that this thing was looking right at him. And so horrified, Zhang just turned and ran away. That night, Zhang found himself inexplicably back at that small pond. Didn't even know how he got there, but at this point, he wasn't questioning anything, because he didn't understand any of this. And as he was next to this pond, at some point, he had that heaviness come over him, and before long, he was on the ground, closing his eyes. However, this time, as he sort of slept or became unconscious, he entered into this sort of dream state, where he became aware that there were whispers all around him. Somebody or something was trying to communicate with him, and at first he couldn't tell what it was. But then he realized it was like the earth was talking to him. It was like the rocks and the nearby water were literally speaking to him. And for some reason, this felt sort of comforting, even though again, he has no idea what to make of this. And then when Zhang woke up again, it was bright out, and all of a sudden Zhang was aware that the forest was alive again. There were sounds coming from everywhere, animals, insects, there was water sounds. It was like things were back to normal. And Zhang, he also had this incredible clear-headedness that he hadn't had for the past several days. It really was like things had gone back to normal. And so Zhang stood up, and he heard the sound of running water nearby, and he followed it to a stream. And so he decided he would just follow this stream right on out of the McLehose Trail. Like, this was going to be the way he would get out of here. But after walking for hours and hours along the stream, he still had not found his way out. The sun was now directly overhead, beaming down on him. He was so hot, he was tired, he was moving slower and slower. His optimism was beginning to fade. And then he looked up, and just up ahead, he saw something that destroyed any of the optimism he had left. Because right up ahead were 3 more shadow figures with their back to him. It was like they were blocking his way towards freedom. And so as Zhang tensed up and prepared to turn and run back deeper into this trail that he was trying to escape, one of these shadow figures turned, and they looked directly at Zhang. And when they did, everything changed. Because Zhang instantly realized this was no shadow figure. This was a real person. They had a face, and they were calling out to him saying, "Hey, do you need any help?" And Zhang was so relieved, so happy. He couldn't even say anything back. He just fell to his knees and wept tears of joy. He was finally saved. It would turn out Zhang's wife had called the police on that first night when Zhang didn't come home. And so the whole time Zhang was out in the woods over these several days, there was actually a massive search party out there looking for him. However, none of the searchers claimed to have seen or heard Zhang at any point, and Zhang did not see or hear any of the searchers. Those people at the end who finally rescued him were just random hikers that happened to see him. But somehow, despite the fact that Zhang really could not have gone very far from his car, I mean, he really didn't cover a huge distance on this trail when this whole experience began, despite that, the searchers never heard or saw Zhang at any point, and Zhang obviously never heard or saw any of them. So they're basically in the exact same area, looking for each other, but nobody sees each other. After being discovered by those 3 real people on MacLeod's trail, Zhang was taken to a hospital where he was examined, and it was determined there was nothing physically wrong with him other than he had not had much to eat or drink in several days. In fact, the official explanation for what happened to Zhang was just that he was really dehydrated. However, Zhang didn't buy that explanation. And when Zhang left the hospital and got back home, he immediately began digging into the history of the MacLeod's trail, and he would quickly discover that he was not the first person to have a totally wild, bizarre, borderline paranormal experience out on that trail. It would turn out the MacLeod's trail cuts across a geographic line called the Sai Kung Barrier. This is an area of the Sai Kung Peninsula that is generally considered to be a portal to other dimensions. And there have been enough people to have otherworldly experiences out on this trail that loosely match what Zhang claims to have seen and experienced, that they dubbed the area this trail is in as the Bermuda Triangle of South China. And adding even more intrigue to this area is the fact that several other very experienced hikers have gone missing along this trail, and they've had huge search parties sent out for them, but they were never found. Zhang would eventually share his story of what happened to him out on the trail in a 3,500-word essay that he posted on social media. He, and many others, believe that when he first fell and collapsed on the trail, that he actually fell through the Sai Kung Barrier and entered another dimension. That for those days that he was wandering around having no idea what was happening to him, that he wasn't really in this dimension anymore. He was somewhere else. Zhang believed the only reason he was able to escape this other dimension was because on his final night in this other place, he began to hear the sounds of the rocks and the water whispering to him. He said the only reason he was able to hear that was because he had sort of accepted his fate, that here he was in this totally strange world that he couldn't understand and didn't have any real expectation to escape from. And it was that sort of resignation that he allowed himself to feel that kind of put him in touch with this dimension, and he believes that's what ultimately allowed him to come back home. Despite those who doubt him, Zhang stands by his version of events. While his time on the trail did not cause him any physical harm, to this day he is still haunted by it. On an April morning in 1993, a surfer named John Doyle was sitting on a surfboard out in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of West Africa, just scanning the water waiting for a wave. John was totally alone out here. There were no other surfers, nothing, and the only sign of human civilization anywhere was John's Land Rover, which was parked up on the sand on the beach. John was an American. He was from Colorado, and so his experience had always been, lots of snow and mountains and trees, because that's Colorado. But now here, off the coast of Africa, it was like a totally different planet. And in fact, today, John was really feeling that because the sun was so hot that day. It was over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and he could actually feel his back starting to burn as he sat there, waiting for the next wave. And so he told himself, actually, that he would just catch one more wave and then call it a day to avoid a sunburn. But as John continued to kind of scan out across the water waiting for this wave, he noticed about 20 meters away was a shark fin swimming in a circle, like stereotypical terrifying shark behavior. And so John is horrified and he wants to get out of the water immediately, but he's far enough away from shore that if he jumped into the water to swim to shore, he's going to be in the water with the shark thrashing around. He's just going to attract the shark over to him. And so John decides his only hope here to escape the shark is actually just to surf in. That way he'll stay out of the water, it's much faster, he'll get to shore, the shark can't follow him there, it'll be fine. And so, trying to stay calm, John continued to keep his eye on the shark that was still 20 meters away, and he also really looked closely for any swell coming towards him that might be big enough to allow him to surf to shore. And thankfully, after only a couple of minutes, John did see a swell coming towards him that seemed like it would be perfect for a final wave. And so at this point, John is facing out to sea towards this swell, towards this shark that's still 20 meters away, and he turns himself around so he's facing towards shore, and then he lays down on his stomach and he begins to paddle towards shore. And as he's doing this, he's checking the swell to see when it's going to come up, when he can stand up, and eventually the swell is right underneath him, and as he's about to stand up on his board and actually surf into shore, he looks into the water that has not quite formed into a wave yet, and he sees the shark. It's literally underneath him. And so John has this sudden surge of adrenaline, and he just jumps up onto his board. He stands up, and for a second, he's stable, he's surfing, and he's riding this wave away from the shark. He's doing exactly what he hoped he could do. He can't believe it. And then, because he was panicked, because he was rushing, because it was a new board, who knows why, the nose of his board suddenly dipped just long enough to throw John off his board and into the water with the shark. And so immediately, as this wave is churning John over, he grabs onto his surfboard and just kind of holds on, and he's waiting for a moment when the wave stops so he can get out of the water, back on his board, and away from the shark. But before the wave even stopped tumbling him over, John suddenly felt the searing pain in his calf. And so John, who's underwater, still clutching his board, he opens his eyes underwater, then he looks down, and through the cloudy water, he can see very clearly it is the shark, and it's a great white shark that is latched on to his leg. And so now, in a total panic, John began punching the nose of the shark, and when he did, the shark actually recoiled and released his leg long enough that John could pull it out. He actually managed to get up onto his board again, and just a second later, almost out of instinct, he was back standing on his board, just surfing along with a leg that was now bleeding profusely into the water. And for a second, John was stable and appeared to be kind of moving towards shore again, but then the shark, it doubled around and swam at John from the side and literally smashed into him, knocking him off the board back into the water. But this time, John managed, when he fell this second time, to actually grab on to the board with both hands. So he has two hands on the board, he's getting tumbled in the water again, but he knows the shark is going to come for him. And so at the last second, he pulled the board close to his body and kind of turned himself like it was a shield. And the shark came flying towards him and bit him. But because he used that surfboard as a shield, the shark just bit the surfboard, ripped off half of it, and swam off with it and began mauling this half of the surfboard. And John, with the other half of the surfboard, he somehow managed to stand up on it. Again, his leg is bleeding everywhere, and he rode this damaged half surfboard into shore successfully away from the shark. And so when John pulled himself up onto the sand, out of the water, he looked back and he saw the shark swimming off. And even though he's in excruciating pain from this attack, he was so relieved. He couldn't believe he actually just survived that. But John did not have time to think about, what good fortune this was in a way, because he was an hour away from the nearest civilization. And between where he was now and that town, there was nothing. There weren't homes, there weren't buildings, there weren't offices, nothing. It was just totally wildlands until you got to that town. And so John knew he would need to get in his car and drive all the way to that town and then get the people of the town to go get medical help. So, he is hours away from getting the help he needs. And so he has no time to waste. And so he crawls through the sand. His leg is killing him, but he's just so focused on getting up to his Land Rover. And he manages to get to his car. He opens the door. He climbs in the driver's seat. And then as soon as he's in there, he shuts and locks the doors. And then he grabs a white t-shirt that he had on the passenger seat and he ripped it into strips. And he used those strips like tourniquets and he wrapped them around his leg, the leg that was bleeding from his calf. And he basically used this tourniquet to attempt to cut off blood flow to his entire right leg to stop the bleeding, to save his life. But the wound on his right leg was so bad and so deep that despite putting on multiple very tight tourniquets, it just wasn't doing very much. He was still losing blood at a pace that likely would kill him before he got to town. And so John was kind of like, well, nothing else I can do but attempt to go to town. So he fired up his car, he reversed off the beach, and began making his way towards town. As John sped along the road, he began to feel very lightheaded. Between the pain in his leg and the extreme heat outside, he just felt very dehydrated and weak. And so he thought to himself, if I can't get a sip of water soon, I'm gonna pass out right now and then I'm done for. And so as he's driving along, John began fumbling around his car, looking for any sort of liquid somewhere in the car. But ultimately, all he found was an empty water bottle. And all he saw in every direction was just this barren African savanna with no people and no water anywhere. And so John just kept on driving, hoping eventually he might find some water source. And luckily, after only a couple of minutes, when his eyelids were really starting to droop and he was having a hard time focusing, he noticed up ahead there was a copse of trees with a little creek that ran through it. And so immediately John pulled over and he got out and he hobbled his way over to the water. He laid down on his stomach, so his face is basically right over the water, and then he just put his face in the water and began to drink. And as he did, he felt his heart rate start to slow down. He felt himself relax a little bit. And he started to think to himself like, hey, I found water, I'm doing okay. Maybe I will survive this. But right as John was starting to feel optimistic, he felt a new shooting pain on his right side. And so with a little bit of strength he had, he managed to turn his head and looked to see what was going on. And staring back at him was a lion who had just bit his side and was now growling and staring at John and beginning to move its jaw left and right to really sink its teeth into John. Now, this is unbelievably painful for John, and he's already dealing with an unbelievable pain in his leg from the shark attack. And so John's experiencing pain that very few people ever get to experience. And it caused this unbelievable surge of adrenaline, one that you would likely get basically right before you die. That was the level of adrenaline he was getting. And with this adrenaline rush, he grabbed a stick and he began hitting this lion who's locked onto his ribs. And he managed to beat the lion off of him. And the lion, it only backed up maybe a few feet, and it's still totally fixated on John, and it's growling and edging towards him. But John, all he could do was just attempt to get to his Land Rover. And so as soon as the lion had let go of him, he just stood up and kind of pathetically began hobbling as fast as he could towards his Land Rover. And he literally just walked past this lion who's still growling at him, kind of trying to size him up. And he just kept on walking towards his car, and he was almost there when he noticed the sound of the lion growling behind him, which had been constant to this point, had suddenly intensified to the point where John couldn't even help himself. He had to turn around and see what was going on. And when he turned around, he saw now there was not just one lion, but an entire pride of lions. There was at least 4 lions that now had all formed a semicircle and were staring at John and moving towards him to eat him. But John really couldn't do anything about this. All he could do was just hopefully get to his Land Rover in time. And so John just turned back around, so his back is to the pride of lions a few feet away from him, and he just continues hobbling towards his car. And as he walked, the lions began swiping at him and cutting his legs open and his arms open. I mean, they're like razor blades just being taken to the backside of him, but they didn't launch a full-bore attack on him. It was like they were just kind of testing him. And then right when the lions were basically about to actually pull John to the ground and eat him, was when John got to the door, opened it up, jumped inside, shut it, and locked it. However, when John went to grab his keys and start the car, he realized he didn't have the keys. And when he turned and looked outside, he saw the pride of lions and his car keys on the ground. He was doomed. He knew there was no way he could get those keys without getting killed in the process. And so John basically just resigned himself to die in his car right here. Like he knew, I'm gonna die in the next few hours. There's nothing I can do. And so he just kind of sat there and waited. And 30 minutes later, John heard a very loud, almost explosion sound coming from somewhere outside of the vehicle. And then he heard it a few more times, and before long, the lions were so startled by it that they ran away. And then he hears what sounds like a series of shutter flashes, like camera flashes. And he's looking around, he can't quite figure out what's even going on, because again, he has all these injuries, he's lost so much blood. And then eventually, John just kind of passes out, having no idea what had just happened. It would turn out there was actually a safari that was happening in the area where John was at the same time, and the safari guide, as they drove past this area, happened to spot John inside of his Land Rover surrounded by lions. And so as all the people in the tour began furiously taking photos of this crazy scene in front of them, the tour guide began firing his rifle into the sky to scare the lions off. And so those were the noises that John was hearing before he passed out. And then after he passed out, the tour guide and all the people on the tour pulled John out of his Land Rover, because now the lions are gone, and they would take him to a hospital where doctors and nurses would have to give him 250 stitches to stitch up all of his various shark and lion wounds. John would make a full recovery, and he would hang up on his wall in his office the broken half of that surfboard that he did successfully manage to ride in to escape the shark. He says the surfboard reminds him how lucky he was.
Every window looked temporary. We carried our names like stolen objects, too young to understand permanence. We ran through avenues unfinished by morning, shoelaces untied, lungs full of static air. Billboards melted in puddles beneath us, cities bending under fluorescent rain. Nobody taught us moderation, so we treated night like celebration. Laughing with chipped teeth and restless shadows, as if gravity could be negotiated. There was beauty in our instability, in how nothing stayed symmetrical. Even our mistakes moved like fireworks, violent for a second, unforgettable after. We burned the sky without asking permission, turning silence into an electric color.
As promised, here is a clip from last week's episode of our amazing podcast, Run Fool, hosted by the incredible, iconic storyteller, Rodney Barnes. Enjoy.
That's when Uma flew in for some damage control. Her tone was polite but firm as she informed the outsider that this was a private party. He needed to leave. Ethan flinched. This was so embarrassing. Was he going to get kicked out next? But the outsider didn't seem bothered. He asked again where Dr. Smith